What if I told you that Walter White's greatest transformation did not begin on the day he cooked methamphetamine for the very first time, but much earlier in the silences and in the small humiliations of everyday life? It sounds counterintuitive, but the truth is that cancer was only the excuse. The real trigger was hidden in traumas that anyone could carry: the fear of failure, the feeling of not being recognized, the pain of feeling invisible inside his own home. It is curious to think that, while many see Walter as a man who turned into a villain, the reality is much more complex. He is not just the teacher who becomes a drug dealer, but the portrait of something that can exist in any of us, who has never felt wasted, who has never wondered if, in the end, they will be remembered for something that truly matters. At this point, Walter stops being just a character and becomes a mirror. And here is the paradox that captures millions of people. The more he says everything is for the family, the more we realize it is for the ego. And that is exactly what makes his journey so fascinating and, at the same time, disturbing. Because deep down, the question that remains is not about Walter White. It is about us. How far would you go to not feel irrelevant? But first, if you are a fan of cinema psychology and want to understand the mind behind your favorite character, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss any video. Walter White is presented to the audience as an ordinary man, almost invisible within his own life. A chemistry teacher in a public school, he carries that air of someone who gave up on big dreams a long time ago. The curious thing is that despite his brilliance, Walter lives limited by a low salary and by a daily life that seems to drain his vitality. He is that kind of person who, if he walked past you on the street, probably would not even draw attention. But it is precisely in this detail that something much greater begins to hide. In the eyes of his family, he is just the dedicated father and the husband who tries to keep the house standing. He works part-time at a car wash, swallowing his pride every single day just to make ends meet. Who has never known someone like that? Someone who, despite having great talents, has to settle for crumbs. The irony is that Walter had a brilliance kept inside, but life seemed to have extinguished all his flames. Only, as you will notice, that fire was merely dormant. There is a silent pain in Walter. He knows he is intelligent, but feels that the world never gave him space to prove it. It is like that brilliant student from school who, years later, you find out is stuck in some job far below what they could be. That hurts, and Walter carries that pain daily, almost like an invisible scar. What no one imagined is that this frustration would become fuel for something unthinkable. He is known for being meticulous, organized, and, at the same time, incredibly patient. As a teacher, he teaches chemistry with passion, but his students rarely notice the brilliance behind his words. And here comes a question. How many people do you know who also live like this, hiding their potential because the world does not value them? Walter is the embodiment of this dilemma, only inside him. This dilemma was about to explode. When we discover that Walter was diagnosed with cancer, everything changes. The fragility of life bursts open before him, and the clock begins to tick. Imagine finding out that maybe you will not be here long enough to leave something for your children. This urgency triggers deep mechanisms in any human being. And in Walter's case, it was the spark that led him to make choices that, until then, seemed inconceivable. The most fascinating detail is that up to this point, Walter is only the portrait of thousands of ordinary men, a worker, a family man, tired of fighting against the system. And that is exactly what grips the viewer, because at some point, we can all see a little bit of Walter inside ourselves. The difference is that not everyone would choose the same path as him. Deep down, Walter is known for his silent genius, the kind that no one notices at first glance. It is almost tragic to realize that someone so intelligent was limited to a classroom full of uninterested teenagers. Who has never felt wasted like that? He is the classic example of underused talent, but when placed under pressure, it reveals itself as an uncontrollable force. And here comes the first major turning point of his story. Walter stops being just a teacher to become something completely different. The invisible man of routine now begins to assume an identity the world would never have imagined. The most intriguing thing is to realize how every detail of his past prepares the ground for this leap. But before we get to that, we need to look closely at the internal conflicts that shaped his choices. The first major conflict of Walter White is the feeling of failure. He looks back and realizes that, at some point in life, he missed the train of great opportunities. He was once brilliant, once close to building something grand, but ended up reduced to overdue bills and a mediocre life. This weight is not only financial, it is existential. It is as if every day he had to live with a better version of himself that never came to exist. Walter White is the living portrait of someone who saw a promising future slip through his fingers. He helped found a research company that later became worth millions, but left it far too early. That miscalculation, that unthought-out decision, imagine looking every single day at what could have been yours and realizing it now belongs to others. This trauma of professional failure haunts Walter like a silent ghost. He knows he is a genius, knows he could have made history in science, but is trapped with a chalkboard in a classroom full of bored teenagers. This discrepancy eats away. It is as if with every class, with every empty stare of his students, he is reminded that he chose wrong. This feeling of waste is not exclusive to Walter, who has never looked back and asked, "What if I had made another choice back then?" That question, seemingly simple, is heavy. At this point enters the bitterest frustration. He sees old colleagues reaping the rewards of something that was, in part, built with his intelligence. This is not just envy, it is mourning for a life not lived. He does not envy only the money or the status, but the validation that his work, his mind, could have changed the world. Now, what happens when someone too intelligent feels wasted? That energy does not vanish, it accumulates. Walter is like a pressure cooker forgotten on low heat, apparently calm on the outside but boiling inside. At some point, that lid would have to blow. And it is precisely in this broth of frustration that Heisenberg is born, the dark version of Walter that no longer accepts being underestimated. This trauma also reflects in the way Walter deals with his family. He feels that Skylar does not see him as the brilliant man he once was. To her, he is only the hardworking husband, ordinary, limited. And that hurts, because there is no greater pain than not being recognized even inside your own home. Deep down, Walter's professional failure is the trigger that feeds his obsession with power. Because in a way, entering the world of crime was the only chance to prove, even if in a distorted way, that he was truly great. Another evident trauma is wounded pride. Walter carries within himself an almost desperate need to be recognized. Pride is one of Walter White's deepest wounds. He sees himself constantly disrespected, diminished, as if the world insists on treating him as someone irrelevant. Working at a car wash, being humiliated by students who do not care about his classes, and depending financially on favors, all of this eats away at his dignity. And when a man's pride is repeatedly crushed, something inside begins to break. Walter is a genius, but no one treats him as such. Imagine being a brilliant pianist and playing every day in an empty bar where no one pays attention. That is the summary of what he feels. The wounded pride accumulates in small, daily doses, like drops of acid slowly corroding his self-esteem. And when finally the last drop overflows, the reaction is not proportional. It is devastating. What makes this wound even more painful is that Walter does not accept help. When his former partner offers financial support for the cancer treatment, he refuses aggressively. To any outsider, this might look like stubbornness, but in reality, it is pride. Accepting the money would be admitting to himself that he failed. Wounded pride also manifests in the way he deals with Skylar. He feels that she treats him as someone fragile, incapable, and this corrodes him inside. Every time she suggests a practical solution or external help, Walter sees it as an affront. It does not matter if her intention is good, to him it is one more reminder that he is not seen as the man capable of supporting his own family. This detail is fascinating because it shows how pride and insecurity walk hand in hand. Walter wants to be respected, but he no longer knows how to achieve that respect legitimately, so he creates a shortcut: power. In the drug underworld, no one dares to disrespect him without consequences. It is there that he finally feels that his pride is intact, even if it is through the fear of others. It is curious to note how, for Walter, pride is worth more than survival itself. He prefers to risk everything rather than accept an undignified life. The most intriguing part is realizing that behind every risky decision lies the desire to rebuild that crushed pride. Walter is not just cooking methamphetamine, he is cooking his own validation. The problem is that the more he tries to feed that pride, the further he strays from what he claimed to be his initial goal, the family. And this contrast opens the space for us to see another trauma, even more intimate. There is also the conflict tied to his masculinity. Walter feels emasculated, powerless, not only because of the disease, but also because of the way his family sees him. One of the greatest shocks in Walter's life is realizing that he is no longer seen as the man of the house. Cancer puts him in a position of physical and emotional fragility that he does not accept. Skylar begins to make decisions for him. His son sees him more as someone to be protected than as a figure of strength, and this strikes directly at his masculine identity. For Walter, losing that role is like losing the essence of who he believed he was. This sense of emasculation appears in small details: the embarrassment of asking for help, the contained anger when he realizes he is not respected as a father or husband, and even the refusal to share his pain. Walter prefers to suffer in silence rather than admit his vulnerability. It is as if he is always trying to prove, at any cost, that he is still capable. And when he discovers power in the criminal underworld, he finally finds the space where his masculinity is once again recognized. Deep down, this fragility is not only it reflects something many men live with: the idea that they must always be strong providers, unshakable, even when the world collapses. Walter clings to this expectation as if it were his lifeline, and it is precisely this urge to recover his masculine strength that leads him to ever darker decisions, opening the way to even deeper traumas. The relationship with death is another trauma that shapes his actions. The cancer diagnosis did not only bring news of a disease, it brought a brutal reminder: his time was running out. Walter found himself facing his own mortality and realized that if he died at that moment, he would leave behind not a legacy, but debts and frustrations. This sense of an unfinished life haunted him like a shadow. It was not only fear of death, it was fear of dying without meaning. It is interesting to think that all of us, at some point, are haunted by this question: what will I leave behind when I am no longer here? For Walter, this reflection became despair. He did not want to be remembered as the broken teacher or the man who never reached where he could have. He wanted to be recognized as someone great, someone who left a mark. And if he could not achieve that through science, he found a twisted way to do it through crime. This relationship with death also explains the urgency of his choices. When you feel that the clock is running faster than ever, it is natural to take more risks. Walter did not have time to wait for opportunities, so he created his own. Deep down, cooking methamphetamine was less about money and more about defying death. The problem is that in trying to build this legacy, Walter begins to confuse love with ego. He says he does everything for the family, but little by little, we realize that he is more concerned with being remembered than with caring for those he loves. And this confusion between legacy and pride is what pushes his story into even darker territories, where the line between hero and villain becomes increasingly blurred. A less obvious but equally strong point is academic frustration. Walter White is undeniably a genius in chemistry, but the cruelest part is that his brilliance was never recognized in the academic world as he dreamed. He imagined a future where his discoveries would be in books, conferences, and awards, but reality was different. This abyss between what he could have been and what he actually is became one of the greatest burdens of his life. Academic frustration is not only about status, but about belonging. Walter wanted to be among the great names of science, to be part of something bigger, but he was condemned to invisibility. It is as if a world-class player had to spend his whole life playing weekend pickup games, and this sense of wasted talent not only hurts, but also fuels a silent rage against all those who, in his mind, underestimated him. The most intriguing part is that this frustration turns into revenge. In the criminal world, Walter uses precisely his intelligence to stand out. The purity of his methamphetamine becomes a symbol of status and respect, and it is at this point that the boundary between science and crime disappears, paving the way for an even more dangerous pursuit: the desire for relevance at any cost. Another intimate conflict is the fear of irrelevance. Think with me, how many of us do not carry this fear of living an entire life and, in the end, being forgotten? Perhaps Walter's deepest trauma is the fear of irrelevance. He did not want to be just another forgotten name in an obituary, one of those who pass without leaving a trace. The idea of living and dying without marking the world terrified him more than cancer itself. and it is this anguish that gives meaning to his plunge into crime. To be remembered, even through fear, was better than not being remembered at all. This fear also translates into an obsession with control. Walter could not stand the idea of life slipping from his hands, as if he were just a passenger of his own destiny. So every risky decision, every step into the underworld, was a desperate attempt to take back the reins. The curious part is that in seeking relevance, he ended up distancing himself from the people who mattered most without realizing the price he was paying. The most fascinating part is that Walter begins to fall in love with this duality. Being both protector and destroyer gave him a strange sense of power. It was as if guilt ceased to be a burden and became fuel to continue. But it is at this point that his journey reaches a decisive turning point, for the search for relevance and the struggle against guilt stop being just traumas. They become the very essence of Heisenberg. All those traumas we explored, failure, wounded pride, fragile masculinity, fear of irrelevance, did not stay stagnant inside Walter. They piled up like dry gunpowder, waiting for a spark. And cancer was exactly that spark. Faced with finitude, Walter decides he will no longer live as an ordinary man. His choices start to be shaped by the desire to leave a legacy. No matter how, the first great decision is to use his talent as a chemist to manufacture methamphetamine. It seems absurd, but in his mind, it was the only quick path to guarantee money for the family. However, it was not just about support, it was also the chance to finally use his genius in an unquestionable way. And when his drug reaches a level of purity never seen before, Walter proves to himself that he was always more than what they said. Little by little, he transforms. From a tired and faded teacher, the alter ego Heisenberg is born. And this name is not chosen by chance. It represents power, respect, and even a new identity to bury the humiliated man he used to be. Walter did not want to be invisible anymore. He wanted to be feared, admired, and remembered. That is when his choices begin to drift away from the discourse of family and start to be driven by pride. The partnership with Jesse Pinkman is another milestone in this transformation. Jesse, a troubled former student, symbolizes exactly the opposite of Walter: impulsive, emotional, undisciplined. But together they form an unlikely duo. Walter sees in Jesse not only a helper, but an extension of himself, almost like the rebellious son who could be molded by his brilliant mind. It is a relationship of power, but also of distorted affection. Jesse, in turn, works as a mirror of Walter's contradictions. While the teacher justifies his choices as necessary, Jesse feels the moral weight of the consequences of his actions. It is as if Walter were the coldness of logic and Jesse the heart that still hesitates. This dynamic creates friction, but also sustains the plot. Walter becomes increasingly darker as Jesse tries to hold on to some remnant of humanity. His choices, however, do not stop at cooking methamphetamine. Walter keeps digging deeper into the world of crime, negotiating with traffickers, facing cartels, and manipulating allies. Each step he takes distances him further from ordinary life and brings him closer to the empire he builds with his own hands. It is a climb where the initial goal, leaving money for the family, turns into an excuse to feed ego and power. The most disturbing part is realizing how these decisions shape not only who Walter becomes, but also who Jesse stops being. Jesse, once just a failure, begins to carry even heavier traumas because of the teacher's manipulations. Walter says he protects him, but in practice, he uses him as a pawn on his chessboard. And in the end, Jesse is perhaps the greatest victim of Walter's transformation into Heisenberg. The man who began as a chemistry teacher ends as a ruthless trafficker. His choices reveal the truth he tried to hide. It was never just for the family. It was for pride, for power, for the desire not to be forgotten. And by dragging Jesse along, he proves that his transformation was not solitary. After all, no one becomes a Heisenberg alone, and this path leaves scars not only on him, but on everyone around him. So tell me, what did you think of this analysis of Walter White's mind? Does it make sense to you to see that behind Heisenberg, there is an ordinary man, full of traumas and desires that, in a way, resemble our own? I want to know your view on this and more. Which character would you like me to analyze in the next video of the channel? Maybe a tormented hero, a classic villain, or even another character from Breaking Bad. Your suggestion may be the next psychological dive we will take together. So leave it in the comments who you want to see in the next analysis, because that will guide me to create even deeper content. And of course, if you enjoyed this reflection, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. That way you will not miss any video and will keep following with me these journeys full of layers, secrets, and reflections that go far beyond the surface of the screens.